In the shadows of human history, there are stories that linger long after they've been told, haunting the world with their chilling aftermath. Among these dark tales, few are as terrifying as the stories of nuclear disasters. These are not the kinds of tragedies that erupt with loud explosions and fiery chaos. Instead, they creep in silently, like a slow, invisible poison, seeping into the very fabric of our existence. It's the kind of terror that doesn't announce itself with a scream. It unfolds quietly, often in the dark corners of the world where the public's gaze cannot reach. Nuclear power, a force harnessed with the promise of infinite energy, was meant to be humanity's triumph over the limits of nature. Yet, in the quest for control over this dangerous force, humanity found itself facing something far more terrifying, an uncontrollable beast that could not be tamed. Every disaster, from the unthinkable events at Chernobyl to the silent, suffocating horror of the Kyshtym disaster, has shown us that nuclear energy, when mismanaged, is not just a threat to our environment, it is a threat to our very survival. As we delve into these stories, we will uncover the details of what happened in the moments leading up to each disaster. The seemingly small errors, the human mistakes, the breakdowns in communication, all the elements that built toward the moment when everything spiraled out of control. These were not just accidents. They were horrific revelations of how fragile our hold on this powerful energy source truly is. The true horror is not only the immediate devastation caused by these disasters, but the long-lasting effects that continue to haunt the survivors and the land itself. Each of these stories, Chernobyl, Fukushima, Kyshtym, and others, unveils a new layer of fear and destruction, as we realize that these catastrophes did not just change the course of history, they shattered the illusion of safety we once held. In the face of nuclear energy's overwhelming power, we are left with only one certainty. In the end, it is not the explosion we need to fear, but the slow, creeping decay that follows in its wake. The Chernobyl Disaster, 1986. It was a quiet night in Pripyat, a city nestled just a few miles from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine. The residents, unaware of the impending catastrophe, carried on with their lives, as they did every night. The Soviet Union's nuclear power was a symbol of progress, and Chernobyl was a shining beacon of its triumph. Little did they know that deep within the heart of the plant, something was beginning to stir, something that would change the world forever. The workers inside reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had no idea they were about to be part of the most devastating event in human history. It was the night of April 25, 1986, and they were conducting a routine safety test to determine how the reactor would behave during a power outage. The test seemed simple enough, but beneath the surface, everything was horribly wrong. The reactor was old, poorly designed, and unstable. But the engineers, operating under intense pressure from their superiors, followed through with the test, unaware of the darkness they were unleashing. The experiment began as expected, but then the reactor's behavior became unpredictable. The power output fluctuated, and the temperature inside the reactor began to rise. The engineers, panicking, removed the control rods in an attempt to maintain stability, but that only made things worse. The reactor, now uncontrollable, was on the edge of a terrifying explosion. At 1:23 a.m., reactor number 4 erupted with a deafening roar. A violent explosion shook the plant, and the force sent a massive cloud of radioactive smoke billowing into the air. The workers who had been standing just feet away were thrown to the ground. The earth trembled beneath their feet as the reactor core ruptured, releasing an unimaginable amount of radiation. In an instant, the plant became a furnace, a place of death, as the radiation seeped into every crevice, poisoning everything in its path. The explosion sent shockwaves through the region, shaking buildings in Pripyat and beyond. The horrifying sight of the fire billowing into the sky was visible for miles, but the full scale of the air was thick with radioactive particles, and the wind carried the poison far beyond Chernobyl's borders. The nearby town of Pripyat, home to the plant workers and their families, remained in the dark. The government told them it was safe to stay, even as radiation levels reached dangerous levels. People went about their lives, oblivious to the invisible death descending upon them. It wasn't until the next day that the residents were told to evacuate, but by then it was too late for many. The radiation had already seeped into their bodies, silently eroding their health. As the weeks passed, the extent of the damage became clear. The workers who had been closest to the reactor began to suffer. Their bodies deteriorated rapidly, their skin burned and blistered, and their organs began to fail. They were the first victims of Chernobyl, but they would not be the last. The fallout spread like a dark shadow, poisoning the land, the water, and the air. Over the years, the true horror of Chernobyl slowly came to light. Thousands of people would suffer from radiation sickness, cancers, and birth defects. The land around the plant became a wasteland, a ghostly place where life could not thrive. The area around Chernobyl remains uninhabitable to this day, a constant reminder of the price paid for pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and technology too far. Chernobyl was not just a disaster, it was a warning. A chilling reminder of the dangers of nuclear power and the horrifying consequences when things go wrong. The scar it left on the landscape, the health of those who lived through it, and the memories of the survivors are etched in history. And while the world has moved on, Chernobyl's legacy remains, a dark, permanent mark on the conscience of mankind. The Fukushima Daiichi Disaster, 2011, March 11, 2011. It started as a regular day in Japan. People were going about their business, workers, students, parents, unaware that nature was about to unleash its fury. In the early afternoon at exactly 2:46 p.m., the earth began to shake. It was an earthquake, a massive one, with a magnitude of 9.0. The ground heaved violently, cracking open, splitting the earth beneath them. Buildings swayed, and the sound of concrete and steel groaning under the pressure filled the air. It was an earthquake like no other. The world around them seemed to hold its breath. This earthquake, while terrifying, was only the beginning. Far off in the Pacific Ocean, under the dark depths of the sea, the true danger was unfolding. As the earthquake continued to shake the land, a monstrous tsunami began to rise from the ocean's depths, gathering strength, building in size, until it became a towering wall of water, crashing toward the Japanese coast. The waves, reaching as high as 40 meters, swept away everything in their path. Homes, cars, buildings, nothing was spared. The destruction was overwhelming, like a force of nature that could not be stopped. But as horrifying as the earthquake and tsunami were, what followed would haunt the world for years to come. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, located on the northeast coast of Japan, stood in the path of the disaster. Situated just miles from the shoreline, the plant was vulnerable, exposed to the full force of the waves. The tsunami hit with devastating power, breaching the sea walls and flooding the plant's critical systems. It was as if the earth itself had set the stage for the horrors that would unfold within the reactor. The workers inside the Fukushima plant had no idea of the impending disaster. They had already experienced the tremors from the earthquake, but their focus was on securing the reactors, ensuring the safety of the plant. They had protocols in place, procedures to follow in case of emergencies. But no one had ever imagined anything like this. The earthquake had triggered automatic safety shutdowns, a sign that the plant was reacting as it should. But the tsunami, this was something else. The floodwaters knocked out the power to the cooling systems, and within minutes, the nightmare began. The reactors, now without cooling, began to heat up. It was a race against time. The plant workers scrambled to restore power, but the floodwaters had already crippled their efforts. The temperature inside the reactors rose uncontrollably, and soon the pressure built to dangerous levels. The nightmare was unfolding before their eyes, but there was nothing they could do to stop it. As the hours passed, the reactors began to suffer catastrophic failures. The pressure relief valves began to open, releasing radioactive gas into the air. A series of explosions rocked the plant, one after another. The air was filled with the sickening sound of metal tearing apart, of walls collapsing under the strain. The first explosion occurred in Reactor 1, followed by others in Reactors 2 and 3. The devastation was unimaginable, but it was only the beginning of the nightmare. The explosions sent a plume of radioactive smoke into the atmosphere, rising high into the sky. It was visible for miles, a dark, ominous cloud that could be seen by all who lived nearby. But even as the radioactive materials spread into the air, the workers inside the plant were still trying to find a way to regain control. But with every passing hour, the situation grew more dire. The radiation levels soared, and the plant became increasingly unstable. By this time, the government had already begun evacuating people from the surrounding areas. The residents of Fukushima and nearby towns were told to leave their homes, but the panic was palpable. People packed their belongings in haste, unsure of whether they would ever return. As they fled, they could only watch in horror as their beloved homes and communities were swallowed by the disaster. As the days turned into weeks, the extent of the damage began to sink in. The reactors at Fukushima were in full meltdown. The core of Reactor 1, Reactor 2, and Reactor 3 had melted down, releasing large amounts of radiation into the environment. The Japanese government declared an official nuclear emergency, and experts from around the world rushed to offer their assistance. But it was clear, the plant was no longer under control. Thousands of workers, many of them volunteers, entered the plant in a desperate bid to stabilize the reactors. They wore protective suits, their faces grim, knowing that every step they took could be their last. They were sacrificing their health, their lives, to prevent a greater disaster, but the radiation levels were so high that even the smallest exposure could cause irreparable damage. They fought to cool the reactors, injecting water, trying desperately to contain the damage, but the odds were against them. Outside the plant, the effects of the disaster rippled outwards. The radiation contamination spread, contaminating the soil, the water, and the air. Crops were destroyed, water sources poisoned. The land itself became uninhabitable. Entire towns were evacuated, some of them never to be repopulated again. The once thriving region of Fukushima was left a wasteland, marked by the scars of the disaster. As months passed, the radiation continued to leak from the damaged reactors. The workers inside the plant struggled to contain the meltdown, but the dangers were immense. The world watched as Japan faced the aftermath of one of the most devastating nuclear accidents in history. The cleanup process would take decades, and even now, the full extent of the disaster's impact remains unknown. Fukushima, like Chernobyl before it, became a reminder of the unimaginable risks that nuclear power carries. The lives of the people in Fukushima were changed forever, and the scars of the disaster will remain for generations to come. It was a nightmare born from the fury of nature and mankind's attempts to control the atom. And as the years go by, we are left with one haunting question. How many more will there be? The 3 Mile Island Disaster, 1979. The morning of March 28, 1979, began like any other in the quiet, picturesque town of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Residents went about their daily routines, unaware that just a few miles away at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, the foundations of safety and control were about to crumble. The world was on the verge of witnessing a terrifying event. one that would forever alter the way humanity viewed nuclear power. It all began with a simple mechanical failure, a malfunction that seemed insignificant at first. A relatively small issue with a valve in the plant's secondary cooling system went unnoticed. But in the intricate web of nuclear operations, every small mistake would soon cascade into something much larger. The system that had been designed to cool the reactor core was compromised. What followed next would test the very limits of human understanding and control. As the reactor core began to heat up, alarms rang throughout the control room, alerting operators to the growing crisis. They scrambled to understand the problem, but the readings they were receiving didn't make sense. The pressure was rising inside the reactor, but the sensors, which should have offered clarity, malfunctioned. The operators, their minds racing, couldn't discern what was real and what was false. They made crucial mistakes, not fully realizing the scale of what they were dealing with. Panic started to settle into their hearts, but they remained calm on the outside, trying to keep their composure. And then it happened. At 4 a.m., a much larger failure occurred, a massive rupture in the secondary cooling system. A flood of hot water began to spill into the containment vessel. At the same time, the coolant water began to drain from the reactor core, raising the temperature and pressure to dangerous levels. The pressure relief valves opened, as they were designed to, but they didn't close again as they should have. The reactor was now completely out of control and the operators couldn't stop it. The core of reactor number 2 was beginning to melt. It was happening slowly at first, a creeping process that the workers inside the control room could not fully comprehend. Radiation began to leak into the atmosphere, but the full scope of the meltdown wasn't yet clear to the plant's workers or the public. The facility's operators were still trying to contain the growing disaster, but they couldn't know how much damage had already been done. In the hours that followed, small explosions were heard from within the plant, the sound of metal and concrete being twisted under the immense heat. Each one was a chilling reminder that they were on the edge of something far worse. The plant's emergency systems kicked in, but they weren't enough. The reactor's core continued to deteriorate, and radiation began seeping from the containment vessel. A thick, invisible cloud of danger spread over the area. As the hours turned into a nightmare, workers inside the control room received conflicting information. Gauges malfunctioned, alarms blared, and the atmosphere inside the plant grew thick with uncertainty. The plant operators had lost control. The plant was a ticking time bomb, ready to unleash its deadly cargo of radioactive material into the world. Outside the plant, no one knew the full extent of what was happening. In the early hours, local authorities were told that everything was under control. It wasn't until hours later that they began to comprehend the scale of the disaster. By the time the word was finally passed to the public, it was too late. A toxic cloud of radioactive gas was slowly drifting into the surrounding areas, and the authorities had no idea how far it would spread. The people of Harrisburg were told to remain calm and to stay inside their homes, but panic began to spread. They could sense something was wrong. Fear set in as people started to evacuate, but they didn't know where to go. The plant's faulty reactor had set off alarms, but the authorities were still struggling to grasp just how dangerous the situation had become. The plant's management had been slow to react, hoping that the emergency systems would eventually stabilize things. But the truth was, the situation was already much worse than they had anticipated. It wasn't until 12 hours after the initial failure that the plant operators began to realize the true scale of the meltdown. By then, reactor number 2's core had suffered severe damage, and radioactive materials had been released into the environment. The surrounding areas had already been contaminated, but the extent of the radiation release was unclear. The public was told to evacuate, but many had already been exposed to harmful radiation without knowing it. For the next several days, the workers at 3 Mile Island continued to struggle, desperately attempting to cool the reactor and bring the situation under control. They worked tirelessly, knowing that their efforts could make the difference between an accident and an all-out nuclear catastrophe. But the damage had already been done. The radioactive cloud that had begun to leak from the reactor continued to spread, contaminating the land, the water, and the air. And yet, the world outside remained largely unaware of just how dire the situation truly was. It wasn't until after the immediate crisis had passed that experts began to study the effects of the 3 Mile Island disaster. The plant was brought under control, but the damage to public trust was incalculable. Radiation levels in the surrounding area were found to be elevated, though not at levels that would immediately threaten the population. But the fear that had gripped Harrisburg and surrounding towns would never fully dissipate. The cleanup of 3 Mile Island was slow, painful, and incredibly expensive. The reactors were shut down for good, and the facility was never fully restored. A haunting reminder of the fragility of human control over nuclear power, 3 Mile Island became a symbol of the dangers of tampering with forces we do not fully understand. While the disaster wasn't as catastrophic as Chernobyl or Fukushima, it marked the beginning of a shift in how the world viewed nuclear energy, a realization that, despite our best efforts, we are never truly in control of the power we wield. The workers at 3 Mile Island had no way of knowing the horror that was unfolding. In the hours that followed, their lives and the lives of the people around them were forever changed. They had narrowly averted a complete meltdown, but the consequences of their actions would haunt them for years to come. The fear of the unknown, of the invisible power lurking within the reactors, would linger long after the disaster had passed. The legacy of 3 Mile Island remains, a terrifying reminder that, no matter how much we think we know, there are forces at work that are far beyond our control. The Kyshtym Disaster, 1957. In the heart of the Soviet Union, far from the eyes of the world, something unspeakable was unfolding. It was September 29, 1957, a day like any other in the isolated town of Kyshtym, Russia. The town, located near the secretive Mayak nuclear facility, was built with a single purpose in mind: to house the workers of one of the most advanced nuclear processing plants in the world. The plant's operations were hidden from the public eye, its activities kept secret under a veil of military and state control. But on that fateful day, the plant would become the center of an unimaginable disaster. The Mayak plant, which had been processing spent nuclear fuel for the Soviet military, had been plagued with safety issues for years. The workers, many of them unaware of the full dangers of their work, toiled in secrecy, unaware of the risks lurking just beneath the surface. The plant itself was a dangerous mix of outdated technology, crumbling infrastructure, and a lack of oversight. But none of these factors prepared them for the catastrophe that was about to unfold. It started in the plant's radioactive waste storage tank, a massive structure designed to hold the deadly byproducts of nuclear processing. The tank, old and fragile, had been filling up with waste for months, and the safety mechanisms that were supposed to keep the radioactive material contained had begun to fail. The tank's pressure increased as the radioactive sludge continued to build up, but the workers, desperate to keep the plant running, ignored the warning signs. They pushed forward, unaware that the very foundation of their facility was crumbling under the weight of its own toxicity. The inevitable happened at 5 p.m. The storage tank, unable to contain the immense pressure, exploded with a deafening roar. The blast sent a shockwave through the plant, shaking the earth beneath their feet. A towering cloud of radioactive debris shot up into the sky, darkening the horizon. It was a mushroom-shaped cloud of death, an ominous warning to anyone within a 100-mile radius. The explosion could be heard for miles, but the true horror was just beginning. Within seconds, the plant was engulfed in a cloud of toxic radiation, and the workers inside the plant were caught in its deadly embrace. The explosion had torn apart the plant's infrastructure, releasing a deadly mix of radioactive materials into the environment. But it wasn't just the immediate blast that posed a danger. It was the long-lasting effects of radiation that would begin to poison everything in its wake. The workers at the plant were exposed to deadly levels of radiation, many of them dying within hours of the explosion. Their bodies were racked with nausea, vomiting, and burns. But even as they suffered, the plant's management tried to keep the disaster quiet. They were told to continue working, to keep their heads down and avoid drawing attention to the growing crisis. The Soviet Union, in the midst of the Cold War, could not afford to have the world know of its nuclear failure. The disaster was kept secret from the public, the government, and even from the nearby towns. The only ones who knew the full scale of the catastrophe were the workers, who were told to continue with their duties despite their worsening health. But the radiation, invisible and insidious, was spreading beyond the confines of the plant. The toxic cloud drifted eastward, poisoning the surrounding towns and villages. Kyshtym, the nearby town, was the first to feel the effects. People began to report strange symptoms: burns, hair loss, nausea, but they had no idea what was truly causing it. The government, eager to conceal the truth, issued orders for the residents to evacuate, but only a small number of people were given any warning. As the days passed, the scale of the disaster began to emerge, but it was already too late. The radioactive fallout had already contaminated the soil, the water, and the air. The Kyshtym Disaster, as it would later be called, was a silent killer, spreading its deadly radiation far and wide. By the time the Soviet government finally acknowledged the full extent of the accident, over 270,000 people had been exposed to harmful levels of radiation. The nearby villages and towns, including Kyshtym itself, were abandoned, left to decay as the land became uninhabitable. But the horror didn't end with the evacuation. The long-term effects of the disaster were just beginning to take their toll. The survivors of the explosion, those who had not died from acute radiation sickness, were left to live in fear of the invisible poison that had entered their bodies. Many of them would develop cancers, birth defects, and other illnesses that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The land around the Mayak plant became a wasteland, an eerie, silent place where nothing could grow. The area was eventually cordoned off, and the few who remained behind were left to grapple with the knowledge that they were living in the shadow of a catastrophe they could never undo. The Kyshtym disaster, despite its severity, remained largely unknown to the world for many years. The Soviet Union kept it hidden, buried under layers of secrecy and state control. It wasn't until the late 1980s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the full scale of the disaster was revealed. Even then, the world struggled to comprehend the horror that had unfolded in the remote corners of Russia. The disaster at Mayak was a chilling reminder of the dangers that lay hidden in the nuclear age, a reminder that, despite our technological advances, we are always at the mercy of forces we cannot control. And as the radiation continued to poison the land, the people, and the future itself, the Kyshtym disaster stood as a silent, tragic warning. Nuclear power, when mismanaged or misunderstood, can unleash horrors far beyond our comprehension.